From a troubled past with drug abuse to his controversial return to the UFC after a 3-year hiatus, here's why Jon Jones should be banned for life. But first things first, let's talk about how Jones was welcomed back into the UFC with open arms. Recently, the MMA fighter made a comeback to UFC 285 after a 3-year hiatus from the promotion. He fought Cyril Gane, and Dana White was over the moon. Jones dominated the Frenchman and won via submission, and everyone celebrated it. Clips went viral of fans all hyped up and cheering on Jones.
And he's putting pressure. Jon Jones, the greatest of all time, and now the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world.
To most of them, it felt like they were watching the best fighter ever fight another match after a short little break. With his recent win, the 35-year-old has cemented his position once again in the UFC long after his hiatus. During Jones's personal timeout, Francis Ngannou often talked about how he wanted to fight him. However, sadly that's not possible considering Ngannou's departure from the UFC. Though, if I had to take a lucky guess, it's believable that Dana would have favored Jones, seeing as he's got a soft spot for him. But if you ask Jones's critics, they think the fighter should be banned altogether. Why? Well, for starters, the first reason that comes to mind is his continued use of drugs throughout his career. As you know, Jon Bones Jones is considered one of the best fighters of all time. But the one thing that consistently stops him from claiming that title is his rather controversial drug abuse. The MMA fighter has an insanely long reach and an already imposing physique, which gives him an advantage over his opponents. Now, let's switch it up a bit and imagine Jones on performance-enhancing drugs. He'd be unstoppable, sure, and that's what's completely unfair about it. Fighters in the UFC work day and night for months preparing for fights, and any performance-enhancing drug usage completely disrespects that struggle. Now, Jones has been caught abusing drugs by the UFC and USADA a total of 3 times. One of the most heart-wrenching moments that came from the UFC was when Jones's longtime rival, Daniel Cormier, was sat down by Dana White and was informed that the fight that Cormier had trained months for had to be cancelled, which led him to break down in tears. What's heartbreaking about this is that Cormier had previously lost to Jones before this and wanted to redeem himself. But this one incident took away all his efforts. Jon Jones completely disregards and disrespects fighters with his drug use. What's insane is that Jones already has athlete DNA in him because both of his other brothers have played in the NFL. So consuming drugs on top of that is kinda overkill. Some also believe that if it weren't for the money that he brings in, Dana White might have already banned him. And if his drug abuse isn't the final nail in the coffin, maybe his criminal record is. It's also very concerning that Jones has a wild rap sheet. He's been arrested a whopping total of 5 times since 2012, and it's not anything minor either. Well, the first time he was arrested was because he was driving under the influence and speeding. That almost never ends well, and it didn't matter this time either, because Jones apparently rammed his car into a lamppost. Yikes. Not only that, but the fighter then crashed his car a second time. But this time, the case was a bit darker, because the other car he hit had a pregnant passenger inside it. After this, Dana had no choice but to strip him of his title. Later, he got arrested again for violating his probation. And the 4th time he was arrested happened because he was once again driving while intoxicated and apparently had also fired a gun. The latest and the grimmest of his arrests occurred in 2021. On the same night he was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, Jones partied and got drunk again. Unfortunately, the night ended with his wife being subjected to domestic violence at his hands. And he was also arrested for misdemeanor damage to a police car. After his past with violence and intoxication, one would assume that the UFC wouldn't open its doors to welcome him again.
More than Cyril Gane has had. Final 10 seconds.
But Jones didn't exactly face dire consequences for his actions. I mean, let's put it this way. Dana White's very well known to be a CEO that runs after what sells. Because of this, some people call him Conor McGregor's #1 fan, since obviously McGregor brings in the most pay-per-view watchers. Ever since Jon Jones came into the discussion as someone who could be deemed the greatest mixed martial artist of all time, it would make sense that Dana gives him a lighter sentence than, say, any other average fighter who would have made the same mistake.
He's not under the chin.
And Gane's head is not really in there.
Certainly applying pressure, though, and keeping his head bent down makes it difficult to breathe. He's making him carry his weight.
Yes.
Think about it. Jones failed his drug test and tested positive for the steroid turinabol and was stripped of his title. But what about Daniel Cormier, whom he faced for that fight in UFC 214? Shouldn't Cormier be somehow compensated for the loss that he suffered at the hands of an unnaturally enhanced opponent? Jones was never made to apologize to the fighters that his actions caused damage to.
It has the potential to be a crazy fight. I was talking to Rogan today, and we bounce off of each other back and forth the things about the fight and how excited we both are to call this fight because it's a big one.
Even after the 2021 domestic violence case, Dana White only said that Las Vegas isn't a good place for Jon Jones. The UFC president even admitted that he thinks that Jon Jones has a lot of demons that he deals with, and it's not shocking now when he does something bad. Regardless, the promotion welcomes him with open arms.
Jones became the youngest champion in UFC history in March of 2011 at UFC 128. He actually foiled a robbery attempt earlier that day.
Something's going on right here. I think they're trying to tell Jon to take the tape off his toe. You know that toe that tore apart during the tail?
And Dana lets him off easy with no consequences. I think this is also why many fans think that the UFC isn't the best environment for an individual like Jon Jones. Because it's not just one player who's acting out. There's plenty of others who are affected by his actions. And I gotta say, those fighters, well, they've got thoughts of their own about Jones too.
He did a good job of not overextending himself and not giving me positions to go get the leg.
Now, let's go to the eye poke. The eye poke,
look at my eye.
it's pretty significant.
Yeah.
It's nasty.
I couldn't see the rest of the fight.
How is it?
Obviously, those involved with what happens in the octagon have much to say about Jon Jones, since they are the ones who have to deal with him the most. Fellow UFC fighter Sean Strickland had some really harsh opinions of Jones. He said that he thought Jon Jones could be the greatest fighter of all time, and previously, he had a good outlook on Jones because he watched him fight when he was growing up. But after learning that he was using performance-enhancing drugs, Strickland thought he should be banned from the UFC for life. Sean was completely relentless in a statement, saying that Jones had completely tainted his legacy, and that everything he's ever done in the UFC should be replaced. According to him, you can't build a legacy if you're not on an even playing field in the first place. And honestly, it's understandable. Even Firas Zahabi, the famed coach of another pound-for-pound GOAT contender, Georges St-Pierre, believes Jones should be banned from the UFC. According to him, anyone who ever fails a drug test should be banned for life, saying that no one who uses drugs can be called the greatest of all time. Zahabi also made a pretty understandable argument, questioning why it is that in cycling, if you get caught, they take away all your medals. But when it's in the UFC, you just receive a small slap on the wrists. Small price to pay for such a long history, right? Now, I can't say if it's a good decision to welcome him into the UFC with such a clear shot at the title, given his troublesome past. But seeing how he clearly has a lot to repent for, maybe he should stay away from the octagon for a while. There you have it. That's why Jon Jones should be banned for life.